Something happened at Bengals practice that might tell us a lot more than the official depth chart ever could. Because while most of the attention immediately went to Jamar Chase being sidelined, the more revealing story may have been the player Cincinnati chose to put on the field with Joe Burrow, Higgins, and the rest of the first-team offense. And when you combine that decision with what happened during practice, what happened the day before, and especially what happened nearly 40 minutes after everybody else was basically done working, it becomes very difficult to ignore what the Bengals might be telling us without actually saying it publicly. Jamar Chase did not practice, and that naturally becomes the first thing Bengals fans want to know about. Chase had a sleeve on his leg, Zach Taylor was asked about his status, and Taylor deferred to Chase's own comments, rather than offering a lengthy update himself. Taylor also indicated that the starters are not going to play Friday, something that was already expected. So Chase being held out of practice should not automatically be treated like some enormous warning sign. The way this situation was discussed in the original report was essentially this: when you have a Ferrari and something does not feel completely right, you do not keep driving it just because it might still run. You put it away, take care of it, and make sure it is ready when the games actually matter. But Chase being out created an opportunity, and this is where the story starts getting really interesting, because Cincinnati had options. Throughout this offseason and training camp, there have been several receivers fighting for attention behind the established names. Colby Young has been part of that conversation. Noah Thomas had been mentioned. Keyshawn Williams was discussed even before training camp began. Andre Iosivas is obviously involved in the structure of this receiving corps. Mitchell Tinsley and Charlie Jones are also part of a crowded competition. But when Cincinnati needed somebody to step in with the first-team offense, it was Dante Meyers, not Colby Young, not some major reshuffling that moved Andre Iosivas around. Dante Meyers. That matters. The first-team grouping described from practice featured Higgins, Andre Iosivas, and Meyers. And for a player who entered this competition without nearly the amount of hype surrounding some of the other receivers, that is a huge development. Just a few weeks ago, the idea that Meyers could not only survive final roster cuts, but actually earn meaningful work with Joe Burrow would have sounded extremely aggressive. Now, it is becoming harder and harder to imagine this roster without him. Meyers did not simply stand with the starters and disappear into the background. He made another play. During 7-on-7 red zone work, Meyers caught a touchdown after beating Jalen Davis. That came after Meyers had already made plays with Burrow the previous day. And then came the part of this story that should really get the attention of Bengals fans. Practice ended. Dante Meyers did not. Joe Burrow did not either. According to Jay Morrison, Burrow and Meyers remained on the practice field for roughly 40 additional minutes, working together after practice. Think about that for a second. This is roster cut week. Every rep matters. Every mistake matters. Every special teams opportunity matters. Cincinnati is getting closer to making decisions that will determine who gets one of those precious 53 roster spots and who suddenly has to start looking for another opportunity. And the quarterback of this football team is spending approximately 40 extra minutes after practice throwing to Dante Meyers. That does not officially guarantee anything. The Bengals have not announced their final roster yet. But there are signals in an NFL training camp that become very difficult to dismiss, and this certainly feels like one of them. It would already be significant if Meyers were simply getting extra reps with the backups. It would already be encouraging if he were making plays in preseason games. It would already help his case if he were proving that he could contribute as a returner. But this is different. He is working with Burrow. He is getting first-team opportunities. He is scoring during practice. And after the scheduled work is finished, he is staying with the franchise quarterback to get even more work. That is why the roster conversation surrounding Dante Meyers suddenly feels like it has changed completely. This is no longer simply, Can Dante Meyers make the Bengals? The better question might now be, how significant can Dante Meyers' role actually become? And there is another piece of this story that makes his rise even more fascinating. Earlier in this process, Burrow apparently contacted Meyers about getting together for a throwing session before training camp. Meyers was in Atlanta when the message came. Burrow wanted to know whether he could be there the following morning. Meyers got in the car. He drove from Atlanta so he could be there for the session with Burrow the next day. That tells you something about why this player has put himself in this position. There are receivers competing for NFL jobs everywhere at this time of the year. Some of them are draft picks. Some were more highly recruited. Some entered camp with bigger expectations. Some already had stronger projections to make their team. Meyers came from the Canadian Football League and entered Cincinnati, having to prove that what he had done there could translate into an NFL opportunity. He was productive in the CFL. The transcription specifically points to him producing more than 1,000 receiving yards in his most recent season there. But even with that production, nothing about an NFL roster spot was guaranteed. So, when your franchise quarterback asks whether you can show up to throw, you show up. When practice ends and there is an opportunity to work for another 40 minutes, you work for another 40 minutes. When Jamar Chase is unavailable and the Bengals give you first-team repetitions, you make the most of them. That is the pattern developing here. Opportunity, response. Opportunity, response. Opportunity, response. And that may be the biggest reason why Meyers has gone from an interesting off-season addition to someone who suddenly feels extraordinarily difficult to cut. There is also a football reason Cincinnati could find him valuable beyond simply rewarding his effort. The Bengals already know exactly what Jamar Chase can do after the catch. Higgins has also improved in that area. But the argument presented around Meyers is that he can bring a slightly different type of movement to this receiver room. Quickness, lateral movement, some wiggle in space, the ability to make someone miss and then get north and south quickly. That type of player can create a different wrinkle in an offense. And that is where the comparison to former Bengal Andrew Hawkins becomes interesting. This is not saying Meyers is guaranteed to become Andrew Hawkins. It is not saying their careers will be identical. The comparison being made is stylistic and functional. A smaller, quick, shifty receiver who can provide something different from the bigger targets around him. When Hawkins was in Cincinnati, the Bengals had other prominent receivers. A.J. Green was there. Marvin Jones was there. Mohamed Sanu was there. Hawkins did not have to become the centerpiece of the receiving corps to become useful. He could create his own role. He could provide a different dimension. That is the possibility starting to emerge with Meyers. Nobody needs Dante Meyers to replace Jamar Chase. Nobody is asking him to replace Higgins, and he does not have to beat Andre Iosivas for the third receiver role in order to matter. In fact, the assessment from the transcription is very clear about Iosivas. He is viewed as the third receiver. The interesting part is what happens immediately behind him. Could Meyers become Cincinnati's fourth receiver? Could Cincinnati design certain packages where his particular skill set gives the offense something it does not get from another player? Could Colby Young have one role because of what he brings physically, while Meyers occupies another role because of his movement and quickness? That is where this suddenly becomes more than a feel-good training camp story. Because if the coaching staff believes Meyers can actually contribute offensively during the regular season, then Cincinnati's roster math gets complicated very quickly. And that brings us to Mitchell Tinsley. Going into final cuts, one of the biggest questions may now be whether Tinsley is completely safe. The logic is fascinating because Meyers' performance could force Cincinnati to make decisions that were not necessarily expected when camp began. At practice, the return order described had Charlie Jones first, K. Sean Williams second, and Dante Meyers third. That could be significant because Meyers may no longer need to win his roster spot primarily through the return game. If Cincinnati believes Meyers has already proven enough as an offensive receiver, perhaps the Bengals can keep a player such as Jones or Williams specifically, because that player provides value in the return game while still finding room for Meyers. And that is when the numbers start becoming uncomfortable. Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Andre Iosivas, Colby Young, Dante Meyers, then potentially one of Charlie Jones or Keyshawn Williams, depending on how Cincinnati handles the return role. That gets you to 6. If Cincinnati keeps 7 receivers, there is potentially still a pathway for Mitchell Tinsley. If Cincinnati does not want to keep 7, however, suddenly somebody many fans assumed would be around could be in danger. That is why Friday becomes so interesting. Not because we necessarily need to see whether Dante Meyers can rescue his roster chances. At this point, the argument is almost the opposite. How much will Cincinnati even allow Meyers to play? That can sometimes tell you something too. The players fighting desperately for their jobs generally need those final preseason snaps. They need one more catch, one more return, one more special teams tackle, one more opportunity to put something on film. But what happens if Meyers does not play very much Friday? What happens if Cincinnati has seen enough? Remember what we just watched in practice. First-team reps, a touchdown, more work with Burrow, an extended throwing session after practice. That certainly does not look like a player the Bengals are desperately trying to evaluate from scratch. It looks like somebody who has earned trust. And trust may be the most important word in this entire conversation. Talent gets attention during training camp. Reliability gets players onto the field during the regular season. Can the quarterback trust you to be where you are supposed to be? Can the coaches trust you to understand the offense? Can the staff put you into different situations without worrying that the moment is too big? Can you contribute beyond one very specific assignment? Everything described about Meyers over the last several weeks is moving in the right direction. He knows the offense well enough to work with the first group. He has made plays. He has shown a willingness to work. He has return ability. He offers a different athletic profile from some of Cincinnati's other receivers. And, perhaps most importantly, Joe Burrow appears willing to invest his own time into developing chemistry with him. That last point is difficult to overlook. Burrow does not make the Bengals' roster decisions. Zach Taylor and the organization still have to determine the final 53. But quarterback-receiver chemistry matters. If your quarterback believes additional work with a receiver is worth 40 minutes after practice during the final week of the preseason, that receiver is clearly doing something right. And it makes Meyers' rise one of the more unexpected developments of Bengals camp. Remember where this conversation started. The off-season discussion focused much more heavily on other names: Colby Young, Noah Thomas, Keyshawn Williams, the established players. The question of who would line up behind Chase and Higgins. Dante Meyers was not the player dominating that discussion. Now he might be impossible to remove from it. And that is what makes stories like this so compelling every August. Depth charts can tell you what a team expected before camp. Practice tells you what players have actually earned. Meyers entered this situation competing against players with draft status, previous NFL experience, and clearer expectations. He could not control any of that. What he could control was whether he showed up when Burrow called. He could control whether he stayed after practice. He could control whether he maximized his opportunities. He could control whether he made a play when Cincinnati put him with the starters. So far, he keeps answering every challenge. That does not mean we should suddenly make unrealistic predictions about his season. It does not mean he is replacing one of Cincinnati's stars. It does not mean the final 53-man roster has officially been announced. But based strictly on what we are seeing and what was reported from practice, it is getting extremely difficult to build a realistic Bengals roster without Dante Meyers on it. And now there are really two things Bengals fans should be watching. First, Jamar Chase. Cincinnati is clearly going to be cautious with one of its most important players. With the starters already expected to sit Friday, there is no reason to unnecessarily push the situation. The regular season is what matters. But second, watch what Cincinnati does with Meyers. If he plays extensively Friday, we get another opportunity to see what he can do. If he barely plays, that may be just as interesting. Because after everything that has happened this week, the conversation may no longer be about whether he belongs. It may be about where Cincinnati plans to use him once the games actually count. And then comes the roster domino effect. Does Charlie Jones stay because of his value in the return game? Does Keyshawn Williams win that role? Does Cincinnati keep 7 receivers? Where does Mitchell Tinsley fit? How much offensive work can Colby Young earn? And can Dante Meyers turn what has already been an impressive climb into a legitimate role alongside Chase, Higgins, and Josephus? Those are the questions that make this final stretch before cut-down day so important. One unexpected player can change an entire position room. And Dante Meyers may have done exactly that. So now I want to hear from Bengals fans, because this receiver battle suddenly looks much different than it did when training camp began. Do you believe Dante Meyers has already done enough to lock up his place on the 53-man roster? And more importantly, do you think he can actually become a meaningful part of this offense during the regular season? Or do you still see him primarily as a depth and special teams option? And when you look at the numbers, which receivers would you keep? Would you carry 7 to avoid losing somebody from this group? Or do you think one of these players has to be the odd man out? Drop your opinion in the comments because I really want to see where Bengals fans stand on this one, especially after Meyers got those first-team opportunities and then stayed on the field for all that extra work with Joe Burrow. And if you enjoyed this Bengals update, hit the like button because it really helps support the channel and helps more Cincinnati fans find these videos. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update. Because with the final preseason game coming and roster cuts right around the corner, things can change extremely quickly. We are going to keep following every major development around this team. So make sure you are subscribed and tell me down below, is Dante Meyers officially a roster lock in your eyes? Who day?